This is October the 11th, 2010, and the second part of an interview with Barbara Gould, continuing her recollections of her work as Resettlement Coordinator with the Boulder Action for Soviet Jewry. And I'm Shirley Steele, and Liz McCutcheon is doing the videography. Barbara, thinking retrospectively, what characteristics made a BASJ staff member successful? And how about a volunteer?
Okay. Well, I think for both, good boundaries were really important, but different than the boundaries that one might find in certainly other professional social work settings, in that anyone who worked for BASJ, whether it was a staff person or a volunteer, became deeply involved with each family and with each individual. So you had the work that happens in helping each individual person adjust to their new surroundings, as well as participating somewhat in family life because we were a community. And sometimes it was a delicate balance, but a very important balance to know that we were there for them. And with that, certainly we got, each and every one of us, so much personally. But the real goal was to provide a safe, encouraging environment for refugees when they came. So it was that delicate balance, I think, of...
was there anybody, or did you as a group help see that the boundaries were being breached, if that were so?
Oh, I think so. I think I did some general volunteer supervision, but yeah, I think that we were in constant discussion with each other, and certainly Bill and I talked, Bill Cohen and I, every single day, so that he liked to know what was going on with each family and how everybody was progressing. So there was always a sense of checks and balances, I think.
We were talking about staff members, but I was thinking about volunteers. They kind of need to be instructed in how to do this.
And we did quite a bit of volunteer training and ongoing volunteer supervision or support, because it was a hard job. It was a wonderful job, but also difficult. I think each one of us wanted to see each person excel and feel good and feel happy all the time. And that really wasn't possible. So, because life is not that way for anybody. And so we had each other to bounce things off of, but and also to set kind of, I guess, realistic goals.
How about the new Americans? What characteristics made for a success?
Women had a much easier time than men.
Why?
Well, I think in some ways women were used to being second-class citizens. Not that Jews were in any way first-class citizens back in the former Soviet Union, but men had a certain degree of power that women never had. And so I think women were used to being seen in that position and didn't just have their self-esteem confirmed by society or by their education or by their job. Women, I think, don't, as a rule, if you can make a general rule like this, women have many different areas of their lives that we take pride in or strengthen our identity with. So we're mothers, we are workers, we have many different roles that we find fulfillment in. The men came over, and especially those who had very good jobs where they were in the former Soviet Union and were not able to use their skills or move into positions that were equivalent to where they had been back there, was very disheartening. And the women seemed to learn English a little bit faster, and sort of had more patience with how they would integrate into the culture here.
Do you have any examples of specific examples of difficulties in adapting?
Well, I think for the men who were doctors in the former Soviet Union or had positions in, not necessarily in government, but positions that were considered high positions or influential positions. It was very difficult to come here and not even be able to take a driving test right away because they couldn't read the books well enough to understand what the laws were, things like that. So it was very depressing for them. It was very depressing. And women have, in our society, I think, a different role than back there, especially for those families that came from Tajikistan and other places that were more of a Muslim culture. So in some ways there was some competition.
How do you mean that?
Competition that women might step into, once they came here, jobs that were equivalent in stature to their, or in status to their husband's jobs, or even, you know, their salary was better, things like that. So I think it was hard. The social structure was upset in many ways. That women were able to come and achieve a little bit faster and a little bit easier, and that the men who needed to study more or learn more to be in an equivalent position to where they were there.
Or even to start all over again.
And to start all over again. And to start all over again is very difficult. I think about it a lot. I think about what would happen if for some reason we had to leave here and start new and learn a new language and learn a new culture and work. Probably cleaning houses or you know, bagging groceries in the supermarket. So people came from very professional positions and needed to do menial labor where they weren't necessarily treated nicely, where they, they didn't speak the language, and so people talked down to them. And not necessarily meaning to, but, or they talked very loudly, that somehow, if they talked like this, people would understand English.
I wish.
So, yeah.
That kind of brings out the not always pleasant subject of loss of status and mourning and homesickness, to put it easily.
You know, that's really the truth. People were very homesick, And I don't know that we were always so understanding about that. We wanted to provide such a lovely environment for them, and didn't want necessarily to, not that we didn't want to deal with people's sorrows. I think we understand more now about the grieving process. Mm-hmm. And you and I had talked about this at a different time, where we looked at issues of adjustment. Well, people need to adjust. People need to become more comfortable with their surroundings, and saw it more an identity issue and an adjustment issue rather than grieving.
I'm thinking of anger, too, as a thing that you might have seen. And
yeah, it's anger at being, first of all, I think day-to-day life back there was very challenging, very, very difficult. And one way that people cope with that is to, I think, anxiety and the tenseness of living in such a difficult situation just gets ratcheted up. And people learn to live at a certain level of, with conflict and anxiety and fear, to the point where they're not thinking consciously about it. They're surviving. And they came here, it was a different kind of survival. Yes. But it wasn't a, their lives weren't being threatened every day. They were safe. And when that happens, all of the emotions, it's like post-traumatic stress disorder, or any of the things that we look at these days that we know about in terms of trauma and how people react to that. So there was more freedom to express negative feelings here. And I think that we realized that what we didn't deal with as well as I wish we would have was the real grieving process. What it means to lose your home, your homeland, everything mm-hmm. that's familiar, your dreams of being in your own country and having things be okay. So we didn't, and people were separated from their families as well. Not everybody came here. Some people had relatives that went to Israel or went to other parts of the world. So there was separation involved. It wasn't all joyful and fun. And I think that was an adjustment for all of us.
You're speaking of staff as well.
Staff, volunteers, and also the new Americans themselves. Mm-hmm. That, there was a point where they had a picture of what America would be like. And the apartments that they got, the struggle with work that they had, trying to earn money, make a living, support their families, didn't look like pictures from magazines.
Streets didn't have gold on them.
The streets were not paved with gold. And if they were other people's streets, not theirs.
Yeah.
And I'm sure sometimes it felt impossible to think that they would be able to succeed in such a way that they would have their own homes and their own, which of course they did. They did, but it took time.
I'm talking a little, excuse me, talking a little bit about adults who were learning English. Do you have any specific stories you can think of of this process, of how it actually worked for different people?
The television was on all the time. Whenever I would do home visits, walk in, the TV was on, and people learned to speak English by watching television, and which really makes a lot of sense. Plus, we had incredible volunteers and tutors, and some people who I think are still doing tutoring, so that we provided classes, and but you know, there's nothing like being out in the real world, and I guess nothing like TV. And there were certain phrases, and people had some basic English when they came. Again, women seem to learn the language a little bit faster than men, but often we would have an exchange of they're teaching me Russian while I taught some English. English idioms is a very hard language, and the things we say sometimes don't make a whole lot of sense. You know, if somebody would be going for an interview and I'd say, hit a home run, you know, what does that mean? We use a lot of sports idioms, I guess, but I do remember some of the children knew English songs before they got here, and I'm not sure how they learned those, but some came knowing how to sing little English songs.
I'm wondering if English television would have been broadcast in Russia at that time.
I don't know. I don't know. Certainly not in the same way it is here.
No.
So.
How would you had group classes or individual instruction in the language?
Both. Sometimes we would have volunteers who would go and visit families in the evening and sit and just do English lessons. And sometimes it would be having a meal together. Well, always having a meal together, because they always fed us very, very well. Such a hospitable group of people, always, and wonderful food. But so much can happen around the dinner table. How do you ask to have, please pass the chicken? Things like that. Basic necessities for being able to carry on conversation. We also had people who would do interviewing skills.
Meaning
so actually, when someone had a job interview, we would have volunteers go and visit with them and do mock interviews, so that people knew not just how to communicate in an interview, but how to dress, how to groom oneself, because grooming sometimes was different there than here, and expectations about that, and basic interviewing skills, from shaking a hand and doing so firmly, and making eye contact was also, you know, there are certain cultural differences, and making eye contact here is very important. When you don't make eye contact, if I were to talk to you like this, you would find that very strange and disconcerting. So we had volunteers who would do role playing.
I'm thinking that even filling out a job application would be somewhat different.
So our volunteers used to fill out job applications with our new Americans, or I did that. And if there were several companies that would hire lots and lots of, lots meaning 4 or 5 at a time, new Americans. And if I could, I would call the employer ahead of time. So.
I'm wondering,
Yeah.
did you have any special in with these companies?
I did. Either I did or our other volunteers did, or we made those connections. People were very eager to help, especially at first. It was, we had some companies like Neodata. There was another one whose name now I can't remember, and I don't know that any of them are around anymore, but they were very welcoming to our folks and had an understanding of what it meant to have an employee who needed help with English skills, and also what it would mean in terms of interviewing.
Were the, this was in the, I'm looking for a date. This was in the late 80s, early 90s. I'm trying to get an idea of what the jobs.
I think it was early 90s.
Uh-huh.
I think it was early 90s because my son was already born. So,
Okay, that's good.
yeah. Yeah. So.
Did they have trouble as far as reporting their incomes? And I'm thinking of the income tax and the Social Security and the financial aspects of being a working person.
Yes, and it's we have a very complicated system here, and we have a system that requires the utmost honesty as well. So I think that there were 2 things. There was the reporting aspect of it, and we did have volunteers who would come and do people's taxes with them, so that we knew and they knew that things were being done well. It is so very complicated. And now I lost my train of thought a little bit. So
We were talking
there was
about taxes and
Yeah.
reporting. I guess what I was talking about was reporting to the government. They had a different relationship with their government.
okay, right, thank you, because that was the other thing. They were very fearful. They were always afraid of government and afraid of even those part of our government that's set up to help, whether it was the police, if or ambulance, or for any kind of emergency, or going to a government agency to ask for help. So going to the Social Security office, which for you and I would just be annoying and frustrating because you have to wait online, was really scary for them. And these forms were frightening, not just because they didn't understand the English, but because anything to do with government and authority was very scary, which was one reason why we needed to work on interviewing skills and other kinds of social skills that we take for granted. But even I can recall one time somebody being stopped. She was speeding. She was hurrying home from work to go feed her kids, and she wasn't going 100 miles an hour, probably 5 or 10 over the speed limit, and a police car behind her with the lights, and she was absolutely terrified to the point where she couldn't speak to the officer, who was well trained enough to understand what was happening. But none of us likes to be pulled over by the police. Most of us don't feel utter terror with that happening. So things like that.
Did you notice while you were working in all these areas, did you notice how some of these people, these new Americans, overcame the fearfulness that they had? What did they use to get past that?
Good cognitive training skills, I suppose, and I don't know that they. I'm not sure how you get over something like that, and I don't know that they have. I think what many of them have been able to do is what any of us does when we have a fear that, whether at one time it was rational or not, we know now would be irrational. Remind ourselves over and over again, I'm here in this country now. This isn't the Soviet Union. This isn't the Soviet police. This is the Boulder police. So just a constant reminder. And I would work with them often, and I'm sure that Carol Watkins, who was the resettlement coordinator after me, did this as well. Learning good, positive self-talk. Because I think the fear was visceral. It wasn't. It was a reasonable reaction given where they came from. So they would have to remind themselves now that they're in a different place and that things are different.
I guess that was part of what BASJ did to be a constant reminder.
And it's one of the reasons that we stayed with families much longer than most other refugee agencies.
Do you have, just as a sideline, maybe not, have you ever done any comparisons with other communities that were doing this resettlement?
Well, I think that Denver would end the formal relationship at 3 or 4 months, if I recall correctly. And we would maintain the professional relationship for at least a year, and sometimes 2. So that, and because we're a smaller community, it doesn't mean that the relationship ended, but the goal was for people to be on their own, very independent by that time. Denver, I know, has expected that to happen much faster. And I like the way we did it. And it's not a criticism of Denver. Denver's a much bigger community with many more resources. And certainly back then, many more resources than we had. And I look at other refugee agencies that I know of now dealing with people who are coming from Africa or other places, and we were able to, with the financial support of a strong Jewish community, maintain professional relationships with our clients a little bit longer than most other refugee agencies.
Just in terms of being right in Boulder, did people, and people probably recognized that these were new citizens, were there any particular reactions from the Boulder citizens who were not in the in-group of the BASJ, but
there's always a group of people who are curious and lovely, and then always a group that maybe isn't so. And sometimes I would hear, almost like out of a Saturday Night Live skit, "What's this about Soviet jewelry?" You have Soviets coming making jewelry? No, jewelry. And I don't know that the plight of Jews and the issue of refuseniks was so well known by the general public. So there was education to be done. We did have a Boulder Sister City project happening at the same time with Dushanbe, where many of our folks were from. And the Sister City project saw themselves as doing cultural trade, developing a cultural relationship between Boulder and Dushanbe, and seemed very not willing to look at what was happening for Jews during that time in Dushanbe. So there was some tension with that part of the community, in that we felt that it was not okay to be silent or non-confrontive about what was happening over there, because Jews were being killed, they were being hurt, children were being abused in that city and elsewhere, and we didn't feel it should be swept under the rug. I know you're hearing my dog crying a little bit, so I'm sorry about that. He just wants to be petted.
Part of this.
Yes, he wants to be part of this, and he's going to jump up here in a minute. So I'm not sure what you'll want to do with the camera, but so there was that. People were generally very interested in giving. When we said we have a need for furniture, people wanted to give furniture. When we said we have a need for, whoops, there he is. Can we cut the camera just for a minute?
Sure.
Sorry.
We were talking about Dushanbe, the Sister City project.
And there was some conflict in the community about that, and we felt like we shouldn't have to battle for recognition of the anti-Semitism that was happening over there, and I think that created some tension within our community here as well. For the most part, people were very generous, but I think that we had to deal with some of what I've seen other refugee organizations deal with. There were times when people wanted to donate their furniture. And I remember one time in particular, it was beautiful furniture that she wanted to give to a family, any family, so that we would, be able to furnish the apartments. Almost all of the apartments were furnished through donations. Very, very generous donations
to
of
the
furniture
BASJ.
to BASJ. Roxanne Balin and her husband Jim she'd come home from being a judge during the day and get her truck and go and move furniture throughout the evening. Sometimes we couldn't take the furniture, either because it wasn't in good working order or because it was too big and wouldn't necessarily fit in the apartment. We couldn't fit king-size beds, for instance. And we had some people very angry with us who felt that that because we were helping poor people, that poor people should accept anything that's given to them. And it's not a great attitude. But for the most part, there was a lot of generosity. There will always be those people who don't like to be around anyone who's different than them. And our new Americans had to deal with that. But they were also they were very vigilant about it, almost hyper-vigilant about it, because they were always afraid that if somebody saw them as different, or if somebody saw them as Jewish, that they could easily be victimized. so what for you and I would be, just an uncomfortable situation, for them could feel devastating. So.
Did it ever spill over so it was a devastating situation?
There was one time we at Congregation Har Hashem, which was the place I worked after Boulder Action for Soviet Jewry, because there's a large religious school there, we always have a big lost and found. And because kids come to Sunday school and leave their coats and jackets, and so big lost and found, and Har Hashem put out a notice saying, for about 6 months, if you don't come claim you're lost and found, we're going to give these things away to people who need them. So after about 6 months of advertising that come and get your stuff or we're going to give it away, they gave it away, and they gave some of the good winter coats to some of our little Russian kids. And one of the little girls was wearing a coat that we gave her in Safeway, and the mom of the child who had left their coat at the synagogue 6 months before saw the coat and said, didn't say, yelled, screamed, "That's my child's coat, you stole my child's coat." Insisted that the people at the grocery store call the police. And it was horrible. It was horrible, horrible in every way. First of all, because, well, for obvious reasons, the child thought she was getting a gift, and was just a kid, didn't understand any of what was going on. And the thought of having even supervisors from the store come and have to deal with them was terrifying, let alone the police.
Did they get in touch with you?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and it was all dealt with. And of course that mom was, I think, very embarrassed, and should have been. But it was an unforgettable experience for all of us. And I'm sure, even though that child is now well in her 20s, she hasn't forgotten it. So, very easy to accuse people who you see as different or who don't communicate as well.
Yeah. Speaking of children, maybe we could talk a little bit about children coming in and starting new schools, and it's sort of a happy subject, but I can see that they might not always be.
Happy subject when teachers understood what the issues were, and so we would go in and meet with teachers, meet with principals.
Would this be the host family or you, or how?
Usually me. Usually me. I think that I had more of the professional face of the agency, so my job was less social than the host families, and in some ways less day-to-day social interaction, I guess. But I often would go into the schools and sometimes went to staffings at the school to discuss particular children who had some learning challenges. But many of our kids went to Columbine Elementary School because there was an ESL program there, and they certainly knew how to work well with kids who were coming from other countries and who didn't speak the language and all of that. So kids did very well and tended to pick up English very, very quickly, certainly more quickly than their parents. So they would come home and help their parents translate things after school, and put kids in a challenging position of needing to be the caregivers and communicators for their parents, even at a very young age. But I think children adapted very well and fairly quickly. Always issues around food. And
how so?
Well, standing, in a cafeteria line, or having, or sitting at lunch, the sense that the cafeteria might run out of food before it's their turn, or that they have food in front of them now, but maybe they wouldn't have food in front of them later at 3 o'clock, so they might take other children's food. Things like that were pretty challenging at first for teachers and principals. And kids learned very quickly that it wasn't okay to be stealing food from others. But the reason for wanting to hoard food, I think, was pretty obvious. And it just took time for them to realize that there would always be enough food for them.
Did they have social interaction? I'm thinking of sleepovers or sports teams. I don't know what they do in sports teams in elementary school, but
yeah, I don't remember sports teams, but that is because I think most of the kids that, at least when I was working for BASJ, most of the kids were pretty young who came, and shy. So probably trying out for a team or being part of a team wasn't something that I recall anyway as happening that often. But kids at first would say to themselves, it's hard, and other children aren't always that nice. But once they had the language, I think they did quite well. And certainly if you look now at the higher education, I mean, many of them, if not most of them, have gone on to college and also post-college work. So,
do you remember ever of a child expressing a wish for something?
Oh, always, like any other child.
I know.
Dolls and trucks and all the electronic toys that were coming into being then. TV commercials make everything look very enticing, and we provided as much as we could, and parents provided as much as they could, but people didn't have a lot of money to spend.
We've talked a lot about the support from the BASJ, and I'm thinking that we touched a little bit before on support from each other. And could we talk about that a little bit, particularly in terms of getting to become independent?
People needed to learn to navigate systems, and it was our job to teach them to do that. And I think that we did that pretty well, but we couldn't be there all the time. I could take, or host families could take people to the doctor the first few months or even through the first year, but we brought a lot of seniors over, and people came, seniors or not, even the children came with pretty significant medical and dental needs. So even when BASJ took a back seat in people's lives, they still had significant needs. There were, Peter Weishenker is the name that comes to mind, and Alla Levy especially, who acted as translators, but also people who knew how to navigate the system. So I remember often calling on Peter to help people, and I don't remember when Peter and his wife Maria both were doctors in Russia, I think, and I'm not sure where they were from, but I think Kiev or Moscow, I'm not positive. But they relied on each other in that way to have help navigating the system. So Peter was able to really speak the medical language, which is hard. So even when he first got here and his day-to-day English wasn't great, he could still talk with another doctor. And that was very, very important. And I think he probably still takes a leadership role in that community. So I relied on him a lot.
How could you tell that the families were becoming independent?
They were working, and if a job didn't last, they knew how to go and get another job.
Okay.
Knowing how and when to ask for help is actually a very important skill as well. So I think that was another measure, that there were certain things that families were willing to take on. They would get themselves to and from appointments eventually on their own, but when things got difficult, knew when and how to ask for help. That's a skill we all need to have, and it's a tough one. Especially as we get older, it's in some ways harder to ask for help. You don't want to appear like you need help, but it's also part of taking care of yourself and taking care of your family. So I think that was another way of seeing independence. And paycheck is a big deal.
I guess I have this mental image of a family that you've been helping for a couple of years, and you're ready to say, okay, you're on your own. And then how do you know that will be accepted, or how do they feel about that?
Because it was built in. It was
Okay.
built in. They knew from the beginning that there would be an end date. And we always talked about when that day would come. So it wasn't a surprise when that day arrived. And there might not have been a big celebration about it or a big ritual about it, but it was mutually agreed upon.
Okay.
And I don't think any of us at BASJ left a family completely unsupported. One of the things that was great about that agency is that there were different levels of contact and different levels of support. So I might have bowed out of the picture in my social work position, but a host family didn't necessarily bow out of the picture. And we certainly did say to host families, well, it's a year or a 2-year commitment. But for most, it didn't feel like it was a job. So the friendships didn't end. The professional relationship.
That's a good differentiation of it.
But it's important to say that just because the professional relationship ended, if a year down the road there was a crisis or a need, we would step back in. There wasn't a sense of, well, you need to deal with that yourself now and all by yourself. We wouldn't treat each other that way, so we didn't treat the new American families that way either.
Were there any coping mechanisms that of a family or a person that you hadn't really expected that were a surprise to you to see? I know you have lots of experience in this, and I'm wondering if they invented anything.
Well, they certainly had a different kind of patience and resilience Okay, so before you heard my dogs, now you hear my bird talking. So I'm sorry about that. Do you want to stop the camera for a minute and just let him?
Coping mechanisms of families.
There was, as I said, a certain patience with the system. I never liked to wait for anything. They understood that waiting was a part of life. Whether you're online at the grocery store or at Social Security or social services, that was a part of it. What was hard to understand was that our government provided some things, but not all things.
Mm.
And they came from a place where, although things were not provided for very well, there was the assumption that the government would provide. And our country does not work that way. And so that was really a learning experience for them. But the patience of dealing with that was, I've never forgotten that.
Mm-hmm.
And when I'm tapping my foot because something's taking 2 minutes instead of happening immediately, I often think of our new American friends, and they would just laugh at my impatience. So there's also a very strong family life that they have. They wasn't that like it was always a party in their homes, but they had relationships that in some ways were stronger and more emotional than many American families that I see. So they coped that way.
Mm-hmm.
They coped by being together.
We haven't talked about religion particularly.
We haven't, and that's interesting, given that Boulder Action for Soviet Jewry was a Jewish organization for Jews. And that was, the religious issues that came up were challenging for everybody. First of all, I think for many of us who were involved in Jewish community, though I really wasn't involved in Jewish community before BASJ, and that's how I got involved in Jewish community, there was a sense of Judaism is so wonderful, so joyful, and offers so much that as soon as the families get here and see that there's religious freedom here, they will embrace Judaism. And that did not happen. And some tried because they thought we wanted that. And they were a group of families who wanted very much to please us and were afraid not to please us. So they tried to jump into Jewish life here, but it really didn't hold for them the kind of, they never felt connected in ways that we wanted them to. We thought these people will instantly become religious Jews. Well, Judaism was never a good thing for them. They were persecuted because they were Jews. To be outwardly Jewish and to see us being outwardly Jewish in our community was frightening. They didn't want to have their children's schools know that their kids were Jewish because they didn't know what would happen to them. And so the instant embracing that I think we all, or many of us, had hoped for really wasn't the reality. And I see a lot of families still, and some I see at synagogues. Some are very involved there, and some are very involved in other synagogues or in the Russian Jewish community in Denver. But for many, they say, you know, we weren't raised with this. We don't, this isn't for us. And it's not that they don't feel strongly about being Jewish and feel a part of the Jewish people, but religiously, it's just not where they are. And that took more adjusting on our part, I think, than on theirs.
Mm-hmm. I was wondering if you have some really favorite memories of people, or joyful memories of people.
I do. I have lots.
Well,
I remember, you know, sitting at the Sterns, learning how to drink vodka.
Okay, it's a good place to start.
I didn't drink too much of it, which is how I can remember that doing that. And going to the airport, and I think I mentioned this last time, was always very wonderful. But what I don't think I mentioned was, you know, it was the old Stapleton Airport, which meant you had to drive through Commerce City and all those refineries, and it stunk. So people would get off the plane and be excited about being here and being with their family members, perhaps, and thinking that they were in the most beautiful place, and the first place they saw were these stinky refineries, and watching their faces as they saw that, and then watching faces as they saw the mountains and Boulder was unforgettable. And being sometimes Michael Landman was somebody who came kind of early on, and Michael would come with me to the airport. His English was excellent, and so he would come and kind of help with translation and things. And as I talked about before, the waiting online, I remember it was before cell phones. I had to make a phone call. I think somebody's plane was late or something, and I was waiting online maybe for 2 minutes, and huffing and puffing and stamping my feet and giving the person on the payphone a dirty look because I wanted them to hurry up, and he just laughed at me and said, "You don't understand anything about waiting if this is what you think waiting is like." And something I've never forgotten.
We're going to just take one stop there, and before we finish, patience.
Yes, patience. Something I still haven't really learned. But and then when the Moiseev family came, many children, and little Alina, who I think was probably 3 or 4 at the time, and didn't speak a word of English, but knew how to sing Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. And at the airport, and then in her new living room, stood in front of me and just did this most magnificent performance of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star with a little dance. Clearly she'd been working on it very hard, and it was lovely. And she still has a very beautiful voice. And taking Alina and her sister Julia and a couple of other kids to a restaurant for the first time. Took them to a restaurant, was the LA Diner, where waiters and waitresses were on roller skates and things like that. And they'd really never been out to a restaurant in that way. And that was a lot of fun. ordering and looking at such a detailed menu, a little overwhelming, but really wonderful. But one of the things now, however many years later, I just saw a family that I hadn't seen for a few years, and they said to me, you know, I remember when you held my hand and you took me to my job interview. And I've been working at that job now, and I'm ready to retire, and I'm very high up in the company. And had it not been that day where you took me by the hand and took me to the interview, I don't know where we would be. And that feels really great.
Well, thank you very much. Feels good to hear that, too. Thanks, Barbara.